We have 1 minute. Oh, right.
So sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I will survive. I like using the legs over here to I'm too short for these chairs, and I gotta put my feet up. It's a whole thing.
Welcome, everybody, to the Traverse City Planning Commission special meeting today, April 23rd. Calling this meeting to order, and first I would like to read our land acknowledgement. The land on which we gather is the territory of the Ottawa and Chippewa peoples who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. Thank you for your strength and resilience in protecting this land and inspiring us to uphold our responsibilities to do the same. Are we taking a roll call?
Yep, I'm going to go ahead and just note it
Okay.
visually.
Okay. So that takes us to number 3, topics for consideration. This is the second part of our discussion on the draft mobility action plan. Mr. Werner, would you like to say something to introduce?
Yeah, I apologize that I was not here last week, but I did catch a glimpse of some of it, and you guys dove into the first part of the discussion, which, as I understood it, highlighted about the process that led to that plan. And today I think we're going to be getting into more depth into the content of it. So with that, again, we have Chris Zoll and James Kilborn from Progressive AE to walk us through this planning process and the contents therein.
Welcome.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate you having us back again. I appreciate you working with our format of the introduction leading up to plan and its recommendations. So we're going to go through. I proposed an agenda of recapping our last meeting, going to the mobility network map, and then some comments, steps. Introductions have been done. So what we discussed last week, recall that we've been working on this for a little bit over 2 years. You know, if you start from the release of the RFP, and here we are in April, as this is being considered along with the master plan process as a document to be included as a part of the master plan. And you guys have had a meeting on that already and other. All right, so we discussed the process that yielded the mobility action plan and its recommendations. And recall that we talked about the leadership committee that's been guiding the development of the document. We talked about our 2 community open houses, one that was done in coordination with the master plan, 2 community surveys, robust amount of responses, again done in conjunction with the master plan, the several joint planning commission and city commission meetings that we've had together, and then the 4 mobility focus group meetings. We also discussed the data and the inputs that were included in the plan, which was the existing traffic volumes, the existing mobility network and sidewalk map, crash data for pedestrians, vehicles, and cyclists, and then that level of stress analysis. Talked about the distance for pedestrians and the level of quality for a cycling facility in the network. So kind of recapping some of what we heard last week, want to make sure that we're getting this correct. We proposed to add these items to the mobility plan, assuming that we go back to the leadership committee and that they also agree with your recommendations as to be added. So some great comments around Beta and adding their transit map to the plan as it exists today. Of course, acknowledging Beta's involvement in the process. They're right along side with us and appreciate their support along the way. We also intend to include some texts around those desire paths or those informal connections that may be outside of the public right-of-way, outside of our control, but are an important part of the network. We can look to include those and encourage those in the right situations, but we recognize the city may not have control of that property in certain areas. We're looking to clarify that all of the mobility improvements will conform to the modern design standards, so they will be compliant. We talked about the seasonality of traffic patterns, and we'll look to acknowledge and clarify that in the plan. On page 66 specifically, we wanted to make sure that we got the comment right around the Planning Commission's role in the capital improvement program, is that they are a reviewing body and not a development body of the capital program. So thank you for that comment last time. We have a sidewalk gap discussion to follow up with. And then there's some potential additional work. It was recommended that maybe we can create a transit walk map, a 5-minute walk around Beta stops. And I don't know if that's something that Beta already has or can further develop. So any other thoughts, comments, feedback? Did we capture it all from our last meeting? Sound accurate?
Yep.
And we'll be glad to take any additional comments that, if we remember along the way, but this is what we took away from the feedback from our meeting last week. All right, so the original intent of the Mobility Action Plan stated that the planning process will include an assessment of the entire street and non-motorized network, identification of communities' values and goals, a review of current policies and ordinances, a balanced summary and applicability of complete streets and other mobility/biking best practices in the city, and an implementation plan that addresses opportunities for micromobility and identifies a preferred mobility and bike network for the city. This is text directly from the RFP that was issued in January of 22. And this connects to some additional work that happened in the city around the complete streets policy. So while we were working on the Mobility Action Plan, City Commission engaged in some work around a complete streets policy. And so at the December 2nd meeting, it was acknowledged here that given the fact that the consultants are working on the Mobility Action Plan and have been charged with presenting recommendations on complete streets in accordance with the RFP language, it was proposed that the City Commission consider adopting a revised complete streets resolution to reinforce the city's commitment to equity and transportation, complete the Mobility Action Plan, and then use the document as a resource to develop the complete streets policy after the plan has been adopted. So this is relevant as we are wanting to make sure that we're getting the steps in the right order. It was then further resolved that, again, the complete streets policy will be guided by the recommendations of the city master plan, and the Mobility Action Plan provide a decision-making matrix for the street design process. Pretty integral to the document today. So we are anticipating that once the policies, once the plans have been adopted, that the City Commission then will move forward with a complete streets plan as a reflection of master plan. All right, so briefly, a recap around the process that went into developing the network map. And we used qualitative data as well as the quantitative data. We showed how that public feedback was translated into a document that created the dots on the map, and the darker the dots, the higher the number of respondents. And then on the quantitative side, we've added that legend that shows the different volumes of traffic. The darker, the higher the traffic volume, according to the MDOT average annual daily traffic. So again, using that qualitative data along with the quantitative data that we gathered, we developed the proposed network mobility map. There were quite a few inputs to this. And without further ado, here's the map. This is one of the key components of the document. I wanted to show this now so that you've got the end in mind as we have a little bit more description of the rationale and methodology that went into developing. So this is the document that is going to help guide the city's decision-making through its capital improvement process when we have the opportunities that are afforded by the CA.
And if I may, real quick, is everyone familiar with Hawk and RRFBs?
No.
Yeah, okay. So the Hawk signals are what we have along Grandview Parkway. So you hit a button and the flashing red lights begin. So vehicles have to stop for that. The RR, it's rectangular rapid flashing beacon. So thank you. We have those in a few other places, like on 8th Street. And they work better in some contexts than others. So on 8th Street, people are pretty good about stopping for them. It's become habit. But the one across from the library where the trail crosses by Skigmaw Gardens and stuff,
Yeah.
I think the context of that street makes it not as effective. City has been spending probably a year and a half looking at ways to improve it. There's a lot of limitations because the railroad right-of-way is right there. So what you can do becomes a little more challenging. But those are the two differences. It's not regulatory like a Hawk where you have to stop. It's just telling you and bringing attention. Now, if a pedestrian is in the crosswalk, then you do have to stop.
Yeah.
So,
Yep, great description. The Hawk, as you said, is regulatory. The formal term that is being used is a pedestrian hybrid beacon, but the slang term Hawk is commonplace. And then the RRFBs are a warning device, and they don't carry that same regulatory requirement that you have to stop unless the pedestrian entered the
I just, for clarity, there are, for example, there's two different types of blue dots, and the smaller ones are existing. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're great, though, right? The traffic signals are there, they're just not great. Because I live on Fair Street, and my wife walks to her job at NMC, and like that crossing there, it exists, it's just not great. So that's just a point of clarity.
Yeah, and there are certain areas, that experiences like, and we are limited by the signal timing, the crossing distance, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't take a closer look.
Yeah.
And a request to the city, consider, are there other options that are available? Example is leading pedestrian intervals, or pedestrian intervals are becoming more commonplace. That's a treatment that would assist.
And it's an MDOT road there, right?
Correct.
Sean?
that
So-
one is, yeah.
So it's like, how much can the city really do? And from what I understand, MDOT is working on redesigning that anyway. So like, I would just hope that we're kind of ahead of that and working on like our own ideas. I have plenty of ideas for the crossing at Fair Street in front. So,
Well, and you bring up a good point, too. There's probably an opportunity, it would take many years to phase it in, but to do signal upgrades throughout the city.
Yeah.
Is it the box span that we've been hanging around engineers? I'm learning some of this. It's kind of an antiquated, it's not today's standard. So instead, the mast arm, like what we have here at 8th and Boardman.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's, and you see the County Road Commission's been replacing theirs
Yeah.
and upgrading that. But yeah, I mean, even the signal timing, like you said, like I was just in Minneapolis this weekend, and the flashing red hand comes to a stop
Yeah.
before the light even turns yellow. So pedestrians have plenty of time to clear
Right.
and stuff. So,
Yeah.
and that's just simple timing if
Yeah.
the equipment is set up to be adjusted in such
Yeah.
a fashion.
Yeah, generally looking at a lot of the signals around town, they are of the older style, and it would be prudent to improve them potentially in a systematic manner, but all of these improvements require the appropriate funding and
Yeah.
timing to do so.
right.
All right, so the end in mind.
Can I have a
Commissioner.
question? Can you explain to me a little bit how you came out more with the proposed maps? In other words, what was the process, sort of more of a step-by-step, with the proposed light network improvements and crossing improvements.
So if I might suggest some of the rationale behind the development of the map, some of the next steps. I did want to show the map just so that we had the end in mind. I'm hoping that some of my next slides will help answer that.
Okay.
And if not, we can look to clarify. All right, some of the rationale behind developing that map that we just showed in particular is that the Mobility Action Plan provides a menu of facility treatment types, but is not prescriptive in what specific road segments are to be designated for which treatment. Okay, so this is because the capital infrastructure improvements are context sensitive and require thoughtful planning and consideration. So we could designate a roadway segment for buffered bike lanes in the plan. However, when it comes time to construct that facility, the buffered bike lanes, in a few years, we may find conditions have changed, and whether there are unforeseen site challenges not originally anticipated or traffic patterns have shifted, or the facility type listed in the plan is no longer adequate for the segment. There's a risk in being overly prescriptive in the plan that it becomes out of date as conditions. Going to number 2, the capital infrastructure improvements require community input and feedback with those most impacted. So we want to make sure that as we are working through the capital improvement program, that we identify the projects that we are engaging citizens and community that are being impacted directly by that project. The people that live there today may not be living there when that capital improvement project comes along, and we're going to want to seek the feedback of those that are living there at the time the project is being. The mobility network map is meant to inform the city's capital improvement program. So, there are many other elements in the capital improvement program besides just the cycling infrastructure, just besides the condition of the roadway. Utilities are a big part of that plan. The stormwater, lighting, water system components, all of these have assets that need to be properly maintained and planned for, and those need to be considered when any given capital improvement project. Right, and number 4, the mobility network map facilitates the city's incremental build-out of its mobility network. It would be wonderful if the dollars were available for us to work through the entire system all at once, but that's not practical, not feasible. It's not a reality. So this plan allows us to, as the dollars are available, as the capital process works through its project selection, that we're asking the appropriate question. We're designing a certain roadway in particular. Are we considering cycling? What does the plan map? So as a result of the network map that's being recommended, you can see the change from currently 73% of the residents in Traverse City are within a quarter mile of an existing facility. As of the full build-out of the plan, our coverage grows to 93%. All residents within Traverse City being able to be within a quarter mile of this facility. This is a great improvement.
It might just be an asterisk at the bottom, but being within a straight line distance, quarter mile, doesn't necessarily mean that even if you're equating a quarter mile to a 5-minute walk, people are within a 5-minute walk of that distance, because there could be fences or private property in the way that, or some other barrier that impedes access.
Good comment, is correct, right? This is more within that, as the crow flies, I believe is the term. There are segments that may not be within that walking distance or that straight line walking distance. We can caveat that with a statement. All right, so in implementing the bike mobility network map by taking a non-prescriptive approach, the plan provides for a menu of options and facility types and a decision-making matrix to support the implementation of the mobility. What this allows us to do is to select the right treatment type at the right, giving the right context, the right community feedback. We need to be able to answer how many dollars do we have available? What other components are going into the project? Are there other agencies involved? So that we can then get that holistic picture of what the appropriate solution is at any given time. So I tried to put in a practical scenario, thinking about Barlow. We look to the map. Barlow Street is identified in the mobility map for implementation. If we were to move that forward today, we would need to have, there's lots of questions, and we just put up a few here, but similar to what I had mentioned earlier, are the curbs going to be impacted with the proposed design? We can't answer that today. We don't know what that improvement project is. The scope is yet to be defined. What is the construction timing and detour plan? How is that going to work with other construction projects? Say if this was planned for 20. What is the condition of the underground utilities? Is it time for those to be replaced? What are the right-of-way constraints? Other impacts right-of-way that would need? Are there any known safety issues in this segment? Maybe it's something that currently isn't reported in the UD10s, but would be something that would be gathered through the community feedback. How are the traffic patterns going to exist and have the answer to that? How does the resident feedback impact the design decision and facility choice? Has the mobility infrastructure been implemented nearby? Connect to something already? Obvious extension of the next project. What is the best way to engage with? So there's a plethora of questions that we don't feel we could answer by going with an overly prescriptive process that we feel would be appropriate when the project is identified. Scope is. So then, this is kind of that summary of going through that process where we're understanding the current conditions of the road, evaluating our options within the matrix, and then we're selecting the right facility given the right constraints. So in implementing the mobility network map, it's going to take time. We're building an entire network. Right? This is a living plan that is intended to be used routinely throughout the year, engaging with capital improvement process and the newly created and implemented design team. We also recognize that mobility is more than just infrastructure. There's a culture, there's an expectation, there's a community of mobility that needs to be recognized, encouraged. And frankly, the more people use the facilities, the more we expect people to use the facilities, the better we can have accountability and expectation of the other modes as well. Understanding, expecting. All right, so this gets us back to, I know, like I had said, the end in mind. Here we are back to that network map in particular. We can reference this, but we also have the plan loaded up that we can go to any specific page that we might have some feedback. Yeah, just we had one other question last time about sidewalk gaps. So I did want to put a slide in here referencing that. There are certain areas of the city that don't currently have sidewalks, and the city's street design manual is very specific about addressing those areas, and we can look to make sure that that's appropriately referenced within the mobility action plan. That's the end of the slideshow.
Thank you. First, I'd like to say a big thank you to staff, to the mobility leadership team, to our consultant, to every person in Traverse City that came to these various public meetings and contributed. Writing these plans are very time-consuming and difficult, so I want to thank everybody involved in this process. But I want to open it up now to questions and comments. Everybody has read the plan, I'm hoping, and are there questions and comments on it?
I got a comment. Thanks for the presentation, very good, by the way, and thanks, I don't know if it was Katie or Sean, whoever sent them out early.
Yeah.
Really good. So in the plan, section 4, mobility culture, I mean, we're seeing maps and we're seeing plans and we're talking about all these different things that we can bring, you know, physical things we can see, things we can touch, all these tangible things to bring to the table to address this issue or this, you know, path going forward. But it was interesting to read that you included mobility culture and some suggestions on how to address that, or maybe bring people around gently to a different place than what they are right now. How does that work with planning and such? Or is that even handled by planning, or is that left up to another portion of this effort?
Yeah, so good question. Let me try to share what I think about that, and maybe Sean will have some other feedback on that as
Sure,
well.
I'd like to have a little bit of a discussion. I mean, it's good information, but it's that thing out there. And
I have the same
you know,
question.
I think we all probably, if we get around town every day, you see some examples of good and not so good every day, and how do we get in the middle?
Yeah, so as a part of encouraging the mobility culture that we want to have, the accountability is on all of us. We all are users of the system, and we need to be mindful of our behaviors, and maybe even at times helping others to be mindful of their behavior. I've shared a story in the past where I was out utilizing a trail in another community, and somebody approached me and said, for your safety, this happened to have two trails. They said, you're supposed to be on this trail. And that happened more than once. And you know, that accountability, there was no requirement of her to share that with me. Messages were consistent, and you could just see that community valued their mobility networks, non-motorized in particular, and encouraged us. I clearly looked like I didn't belong. Suitcase in tow, and she was confident enough to share that with me so that I would understand. So other elements of how we generate that culture of mobility relate to how we deliver some of our services and how we support it through our policies and our spending. So as we implement more and more infrastructure, are we indeed bringing along the maintenance and operation dollars for that? You know, are we involving the emergency response services to make sure that you guys are able to deliver your services appropriately? Is there a balance between the city's current perspective on how we do business today and how we can do business in the future, which may involve changing some of our current practices? Are we open to that? Are we willing to modify some of? So through our actions, through our spending, through the implementation of the network, we're going to continue to slowly evolve that.
And I want to piggyback on that because I had the same feeling when I was reading this. You spent quite a bit of time and pages talking about this culture and how difficult it's going to be to change this culture, but you also gave us some really interesting examples from other cities about how they did it. And I guess what I would like to see under these recommendations is something more specific about an education effort to attempt to change this culture of cars that you talked about in the plan, similarly to how some of your examples worked. I'd really like to see that. I think I'm with Chief Toller on this, that none of this can happen unless we start to change this culture. And you had examples in here of feedback from people saying, I'm afraid to cross the street here, I'm afraid to ride my bike here, there's just too many cars. So I think it requires a lot of education and discussion to start accepting multimodal mobility.
Good feedback.
Yeah, and there's a lot more that goes into it too. I think education is key. So like when I was working on my master's, that was my thesis, was a bicycle education plan for the city of Richmond, because that gets overlooked a lot. There's a lot of people that are interested, but they just don't know enough to take that first step. And so in many cases, we work with our community partners. So TART is great at that. Smart Commute Week is a good way to rally people to get out and try riding to work. Or I've been to workshops at the Little Fleet, like Winter Smart Commute workshop. So, okay, well now it's getting cold out. I've ridden my bike all summer. Do I put it away for the winter? Or no, here's some people telling me some tips and tricks. So I think that's part of it. through our own actions and how we behave as users of the non-motorized network. And part of that culture comes from prioritization. I don't think anyone here would be shocked that our sidewalks are the last thing that gets plowed, right? You know, I mean, that's a sign of your culture towards mobility. So those are conversations that need to happen in an ongoing effort beyond just what this plan is saying. But I think it's bringing attention to how we can focus on that.
Yeah, and I agree, Sean, thanks, Madam Chairman, but, you know, that seems to me that would be a consistent effort. You know, we're not gonna, oh, we're good after 2 years or
No,
whatever.
yeah.
It's gonna be a consistent, kind of gentle, underlying theme that's pushed out there. I mean, you know, I sit on a traffic, or the Transportation Committee, excuse me, and traffic comment comes up once. So we're talking about not correcting, but maybe modifying or influencing human behavior. And I see that kind of an overlay here, that's what we're asking to do. We're asking people that either they're not thinking about it, don't know any better, or maybe they just don't care, to change their behavior for the safety of others. And I see that as like a constant effort that's probably never going to go away.
Oh, yeah, true, but, and even in these examples, I mean, there's dollars that are gonna have to be put toward that. That's why I kind of wanted something specifically stated. Like, in some of these other cities, there was signage in some of the examples you gave. There were very positive messages about different kinds of methods of transportation, so, yeah.
I'll give you one example. In the city of Chicago, this was a couple years ago, we were there, but we were riding from the north side into downtown on bikes, and there's on-street bike lane, but there's constant signs that say, for the bikes, at 12 miles per hour, you will hit all the green lights. So they've timed their signals to prioritize that mode of transportation for that user. I think the other thing that we all as citizens can do is be better at humanizing all the mode users. There's a lot of stigmas attached with them, you know?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, talk about it.
This community's quite a bit progressive, but you go to other communities, you see someone riding a bike, the assumption by the observers is they're poor or they've had 3 DUIs. You know, it's not a choice, but they're forced to use that. That mentality is starting to change, but we see that with public transit too. I got a 91-year-old grandma who does not drive anymore, and she has a lot of thoughts on public transit and why she won't use it. We've had some interesting conversations about
You
that.
gotta
But
remove the stigma of that, too.
But, you know, that's a human riding that bike. That's a human walking. That's a human driving that car, you know, and we want everyone to be
But some
safe.
city, I mean, you know, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, I went to Portland, Oregon, and they have amazing bike networks. I mean, they really prize that. So
Yeah.
that goes to the culture, right?
Yeah, definitely. And that, I think that goes to what Chris was saying too. Like, that effort started in the 70s to
Yeah.
get to where we are today. And it took time, and it was, they didn't just do some projects in
sure.
the 70s. That's been their mobility culture for 50 years now. And that's what it's taken. But again, they had leadership and advocate groups like all working and pushing for that.
Would it make sense to put some of our local examples in this section? Like we have the requirement or the request that private lot owners install the heated sidewalks. Like we have little things here and there that are examples that could be helpful to use in this section. The other one is like we just, within the time that I've been on this board, we increased setbacks. So I think that would be a good example of like increasing the public street setbacks so that we were trying to prioritize walkers. I think there are like tiny examples where we have tried to move that way that we could bring up just so that we can say we are moving in the right direction, but that we need a lot more
We
of
need
that.
more, yeah. I mean, even when you gave many great examples of different kinds of bike lanes, but some of them require you to remove parking in order to have them. That's part of the culture too. You know, are people going to be willing to do that? So that's why I just think, I don't know how the rest of you feel, but I think there has to be something in the recommendations about education and talking about these.
I'd be a little concerned about getting too deep into the weeds with specific recommendations in this plan. I mean, this plan is supposed to be a guide for us. So you can take this plan once it's adopted and each year look at identifying aspects or things that you want to move towards. And you can adopt those into your goals for the year.
Sure.
Because you put them in something in the plan, then when you start checking them off, people start feeling like, well, the plan is finished, and, oh, now you want to do, we did A, B, and C, now you want to do D and E, but that's not in the plan.
I'm just suggesting
And-
something simple, like, there has to be an education effort.
I think a lot of that's in here already.
Yeah.
I think it's,
But it's-
and I think, but again, that's something that's so flexible, and you deal with organizations whose structures, a lot like Sean said, there's a lot of organizations out there who, will help move this along, will help push this and be leaders on this. But those organizations are not static. They change, they morph, and so if you start getting too much into it, I think you could, but if you had something that you wanted to do right off the bat that was really strong, then you could always do that as a first step. But it's almost like putting a zoning ordinance in the master plan, is kind of how I'm looking at it, as opposed to, you have all these options, and I think the more options you look at, different things, it's like the different ways you can address, making these facilities. I think that's great, and I think what they're talking about, same thing with capital improvements, is that when you're doing these capital improvements, that's a whole nother thing than having the idea of it or the plan for doing something for the street. When he actually gets to doing the street, there's all these other things you have to consider. So I want it to be more of, we have goals, and I think I understand your question is, are we going to do anything with this plan? Which is always the worry. And then the question
No, that's not
becomes,
my question. My question is, if we don't try to change the culture at the beginning, then how is the plan ever going to be successful? So all I'm saying is, when I'm looking at the policy recommendations, they're talking about traffic codes and bicycle and coaster toys, removing languages, considering this, parking generally, et cetera. But there's not a general thing that says an education effort on multimodal transportation. That's all I'm saying. It doesn't have to be specific. It doesn't say 100% what we're talking about. It's just that there's going to be, in the policy recommendations, some kind of education effort, like examples that they gave us in the plan of other cities, of what they did.
Yeah, and I think that'd be pretty easy to add
Yeah.
in, the
so you
focus
want
and
to
emphasis.
basically say, in other words, all the suggestions they give, you want the language to be stronger. It basically says,
I
we're
wanted
going
to
pursue.
exist in the policy recommendations section,
Okay.
but very general. I'm not saying we're going to talk about this, 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 and this to change this and this. It's just that there's going to be a general education effort.
To Brian's point, that is something that we struggled with throughout the process, was how prescriptive to be. At this level, this planning effort isn't looking, at 3 continuous blocks of redesign, and therefore we didn't have all the information to be super prescriptive on the exact design. Plus, we wanted flexibility, because more often than not, when you're too prescriptive, when you get out in the field and you start working on it, you realize maybe A and B aren't going to work and you have to go with C, but then people have already been married to A and B. And we didn't feel comfortable without that knowledge of being that prescriptive. And so the things that we focused on with this plan was establishing community values, how we make decisions related to non-motorized, and then creating that network map of where we know it's going to be. Then we come in, to your point, with the CIP. Okay, so where do we know we have to reconstruct a street? Where do we know we have to replace utilities? When we put it back together, what should it look like? And even the different facility types, if you just looked at certain metrics like AADT and traffic speed and stuff like that, that doesn't take into account, are there commercial uses that people are going to want to be visiting? Do you have a lot of curb cuts? Is there slope? So all these little things that we'll be working out as we go through that process. Now, there may be a street that's on the network map that we realize has great pavement and has no utility needs for the next 20 years. Well, then we can probably start independently looking at a non-motorized improvement project for that street. But what we really want to do is make sure we're not spending the money to put in a non-motorized structure that 2 years we have to rip everything out to
No, I
replace the
understand.
water and sewer and stuff like that.
Right,
So,
and that's covered throughout
Yeah.
the plan, and you covered that here too, all these other things that have to be addressed.
Good.
To fill the map, but what I was saying is you also have different options for different streets.
Yeah.
That they're all, and where I think before we were a little bit too rigid in what was considered, what each street had to have, sidewalks on both sides, this, and the other thing. And of course, we left other parts out. So you had to have sidewalks, but you never had to have bike lanes. So, anyways, but yeah, so I like this. I like the flexibility in the map, I think, and I like this different suggestions, different types of improvements, and the ability to look and see what fits, and that will be our role as a planning commissioner when we're looking at these street improvements, is to look to see how they fit the master plan and the mobility plan. So we'll have an ability to chime in. I'm just, I don't know what we do as a planning commission other than adopt a policy. It's eventually, education costs money and all these things, and so that's really depends a lot on the city commission or it takes staff time. So I don't know, but that's a good question. What can we do as a planning commission? What's our role as planning commissioners in this process? So we kind of have a guide of what we can do as planners.
I think from a staff perspective, it would be helpful, we'll use the education example again, if there were some objectives that the planning commission wanted to achieve, and then we can go and start working on, okay, how do we meet those objectives? Because more than likely, it's going to take partnerships. We can take the example of the Pines and our unhoused population. It's not the city working on it alone. There's a whole network of entities working on that issue, and some of these things may take that type of approach to be successful, so.
A few other thoughts on what the planning commission may be able to assist with. As the capital improvement plan comes to you for review, asking the question, is this CIP in compliance with the mobility network map? Was every segment considered? Are we planning to implement what's shown? Secondly, we have recommendations about annual reporting, such that at the end of any specific meaningful period of time, maybe it's the end of the year, or maybe it's an update in January, what did we accomplish in the mobility plan last year? Added this many miles of this, right? We're keeping score of progress of the plan. Another can act on that. And then also looking for other ways to share messages. Are there partnerships? We put something in the water bill that reminds everybody of mobility culture that we're looking to encourage. Can we put it in our Facebook feeds and our regular communications so that, it doesn't necessarily have to be an expensive education program. I think the community would benefit from an education program. We can continue to deliver those messages in the means that we're already delivering other messages.
Yeah, if you could go back to the actual slide of the map. And one question or concern I have going forward is, yes, this is supposed to be a guiding document. It's not prescriptive about exactly where and when things are going to go, but if we are using it as a guiding document for the capital improvements plan and other things going forward, and we can say, hey, here's a project that agrees with the goals of greater mobility, but it's, say, in an area that's already highly served by walking or biking infrastructure, and even if it's consistent on the goals, the map seems to present a case that it's less useful. Like, though there are some shown, the Lower Borden plan has proposals for additional both pedestrian crossings, like there could be one connecting the two sections of Pine Street, or redoing a pedestrian bridge in another place, but it's not on the map, and the map is showing that that's one of the densest areas for pathways in the city. So I'm a little curious how you would see it as the goals of the plan versus what the plan is actually showing.
Yeah, and I believe we touched on this a little bit with our last meeting. Being a plan document, they are to be lived and amended. There is, or there, I recommend that there should be a way to amend the plan through the right process and evaluation and channels, similar to how a master plan is amended at times. So if there is a change in condition, if there's an opportunity that presents itself, if there's a gap or a demand that isn't properly represented in the network as shown, we have a process to update the plan in accordance with how things have changed.
And I think ideally what we would want to do with the master plan, you know, every 5 years we have to review it and you don't have to update it, but, you know, we're setting it up for updates every 5 years. We could go through this process then too. What has been accomplished as far as building out this network? What still needs to be done? Things like that.
So I can go back to my first question about the map. Can you tell me a little bit about the process that went into how you got the purple lines on the map?
Yep, so as we were showing earlier, the quantitative and qualitative feedback were inputs into the plan. So we had asked the community a bunch of different questions, drawing exercises, and verbal exercises, sticky notes and values and visions, you know, all of the feedback that we had gathered. And that showed us areas of concern, areas of interest, destinations in particular. And you add that with the low stress evaluation, which is a proprietary tool that our partner Tool Design Group utilizes to determine level of stress, to identify routes that are more comfortable for a wider range of users, so that we aren't just designing for the top most aggressive cyclists or pedestrians, but a broader range. You add that to the intent of that coverage map, where we're talking about within a quarter mile, 3% of all households as the crow flies. And then you married that up with the existing infrastructure that's there today. Now, there are some adjustments along the way of some of the existing, so the TART in town as it exists today is proposed to change to State Street connection, 8th Street connection, and that gives us that coverage that's it. Now, none of this precludes a cyclist or pedestrian from using any given facility. If it's more convenient for you to ride on Washington, then you're allowed to do so. It's a viable facility for you. But as a part of building out the network, those were the inputs that were used to create this map in particular.
Was there any, did the steering committee make recommendations or suggestions on
We
this
went
also?
through modifying this map 3 or 4 different.
Yeah, I want to say we had at least 3 meetings where those members of the leadership team, which included members of TART, Disability Network, Norte, Beta, DDA, City, all working on that, providing, you know, kind of on the ground context of like where we know people like to go already, things that you may not derive just from looking at a map. The other thing that we did that was very helpful was the leadership team and the consultant team spent a whole day on bikes riding around the city, looking at the good, the bad, the ugly to get a sense. And at that point, we'd already started having people identify problem areas so we could go out there and see them for ourselves and further educate and inform that plan.
So I have some questions about the actual layout of the map. And comments and, well, one general comment, just a technical editorial comment on all of your maps, is that they all seem to, I can't tell this, but they seem to cut off or come close to cutting off, at least in the PDF versions that we have, little peripheral areas of the city. So some of our maps, you don't get that whole top of peninsula. I look at this one right now, is that I can't tell if that's the end of the city or not. On my map, it looks like it's slid too far to the left and part of the city got cut off. I can't tell on your map. You got a lot of white space on the right, and on mine, I got nothing on the left. So you can go through that, and I don't know if you can make some adjustments. I just don't like to see sections of the city cut out for whatever reasons. Airport, whole nother question. But this airport is still part of the city. I mean, and there is some, Costco did put a path in front of it. Now there's supposed to be a technical, even though you've got to go out of the city to get to part of it. Really, you have to go out of the city to get to the north side of the airport, but it's still in the city. So it'd be nicer to see, and I can't tell if we're taking that into consideration or not, because it seems on my map it disappears at Boone, or most just halfway south of Boone. That's one question I have. You have other sections of major corridors that are not included with bike facilities, these travel facilities. Commercial corridors, I see them as destinations for people. So most of Munson, a good section of Munson, parts of, and interesting sections of Front don't have connections, and I'm not sure why. And that's my, so that's one concern. I just think that you've got these commercial destinations where people go to work and people go sometimes to shop or for services, and they're not connected. I mean, and you've already heard me, beat the horse on, lack of connections along Munson, of sidewalk connection, pedestrians. But I don't know if that's left out because, you're proposing a crossing at Davis, but there's no bike connection for that. The other question I had was the cutting through the cemetery. Is that at all controversial?
I mean, I think it would depend who you ask in their perspective. We did look into that early in the process, and as I understood it, you're not prohibited from riding bikes through
You
there.
are.
No,
Actually,
it's
I-
at the city manager's
Discretion.
discretion.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so.
It hasn't been enforced, but it is an ordinance. in
Yeah,
our
and there's been a
cemetery
lot
policy.
of conversations over the last 2 years about connections through there with different community members. I know a former city manager perceived it as disrespectful for bikes to ride through there. That's one perception. You go back 80, 100 years, cemeteries were treated as public parks because there wasn't a lot of public space, so there's different ways that people look at it. So I think in our most recent discussion, which has been some time, is that like if bikes were cutting through there and respectfully staying on the paths, that would not be problematic. Now, it gets a little tricky when you get to the Parsons roadside because there isn't really any kind of natural connection at that point. Because we rode that. We went through the cemetery and we had to, cut through the grass and cut across where there was no crossing west of the roundabout. But it gave us a feel for it and everyone who participated of what could be there.
Yeah, and there is a desire path, kind of snaking through the woods, connecting the residential neighborhood wedged in between Terrace and Cromwell to airport access. But that's just a squiggle on Strava that doesn't show up on any of our maps.
Yeah, no, and I understand that, and I'm looking, I guess part of my question is how, you know, say somebody said, you know, say the city commission, or we want to improve that trail, make that connection, and it becomes a huge political debate. And the city says, okay, instead, we're going to just run it along 8th Street, which already exists, and cut up through Cromwell and the vacant undeveloped area, to those woods. And we're going to declare that path park, and so it's a non-issue going forward. And then somebody says, the planning commission says, it's not part of the mobility plan, it's not on the map. Does it meet the mobility plan? Does that become an issue for us? Or are we saying this is where it should go?
Yeah, I mean, this is where we're saying it should go. Like all plans, it's not legally binding, it's guiding. If we think in the example of a master plan, you can get into some other situations if you approve a zoning change that is not consistent with the master plan. I think it'd be hard to bring that case here in the example that you just gave, but ultimately that's our reality, you know, and it's up to the city commission to make those type of decisions when proposed to them. Because from my experience, I think as soon as they propose it going through Cromwell, they would have just as much of a sizable voice opposing that. So you just with that example, it's always trade-offs, you know.
And
Yeah,
it can be
but-
amended.
I mean, yeah, but they just, you could even just cut down the very first one, and those people may be object or may not. I think it's a question for them. It's, you know, also then it creates access, and that was one of the complaints about when the city closed that gate. And there was a big outcry from people who use that, cut through there, use that across through the cemetery to get on to access the Tart Trail.
Yeah.
From that whole neighborhood. And now we still haven't addressed their issues, other than they need to, you know, find an access or create an access or a path to make it work. So, I mean, whether or not, I'm not saying my idea is the best, I'm just wondering, you know, some of this stuff could have some fallout. And I guess I still want to know what the reason is we're not trying to put it along all the major corridors, because elsewhere in the plan, that seems to be a sort of a point of emphasis that, you know, we need to be able to create more safe stress and help create facilities that help reduce the stress on these, you know, commercial corridors that attract, as I said, customers. And
From a cyclist perspective, utilizing adjacent facility that has lower stress is more often a more enjoyable experience for that cyclist that still provides access to some of those key commercial areas that you're talking about. You know, by making those network connections across the trail, the putting cycling facilities on every major street is often not creating that inviting scenario where more of the cyclists would be interested in using that facility. The higher the volumes, the faster the speeds, the less comfortable they bulk or average users are with that given facility. So that level of stress analysis was used to determine reasonable adjacent routes that would better fit more users.
And another thing we looked at when we're like really the feasibility of getting a facility in the space and being able to fit it. So that, like your example of Munson, it does become difficult to fit anything else in the right of way. Doesn't mean it couldn't, just a different conversation, and that then we need to acquire easements and stuff like that to fit it. I mean, we're seeing that right now when you get down by the Blue Goat, that section of the same trunk line. I mean, the sidewalks are right up against the curb in order to keep it all within the right of way. So that's why we were focusing on what more realistic.
That's why those sections are not.
Yeah. One, we don't have as much control over them because they're state trunk lines. In even Division, doesn't have much on there because, you know, to put in the improvements they did from 10th to, I think you might recall, they had to do a ballot initiative to get voters to approve acquiring parkland just to fit in the sidewalks and things like that.
Two other perspectives, if I might. Our capital improvement program is likely going to only have so many dollars. And you may want to consider an opportunity for a broader impact than spending a whole bunch of money on one smaller section specific. You're going to have to, evaluate the priorities of impact based on the capital projects that are being proposed. I do think you can create some systematic improvements as well. So to do several traffic signals at the same time or improve signal timing in certain areas that in a systematic. And then secondly, we recognize that we're not going to make everybody happy. I think we talked a little bit about this last time. Well, there are difficult decisions ahead of us, right? We are going to have to work through those conversations. We're going to have to work through that context. But now we have a plan that shows a larger understanding of what we're looking to achieve. Before, we were trying to implement a new bike facility, impacted somebody, maybe it removed parking or comfortable with. It was harder to explain the why. I would suggest that now having a plan or a map, we're able to tell the story in a more broader perspective for the benefit of the network. Maybe that'll be more palatable.
I mean, I love the plan, okay? I'm not thrilled with the map, and maybe it's me personally because of my neighborhood. So it makes no improvements for where I live. So it's the current route I have right now. If I'm going downtown, I go up to Front Street, I go north to Front Street, I go down Front Street, I cross at Fair, I get in the park, but you don't take that trail around the outside because to get underneath there, that's a bridge over that access. So you then have to come through the parking lot, through the sidewalks around there, through the parking lot to go under the bridge. Then you come out down that street, then you get on State Street, and then you go down State Street. And that's how you get where you need to go. And if you're going somewhere else, you might ride along the front if you're just trying to go to Hardin's. So even that trip now with the coffee shop is and those intersections are very tricky. We fix that. We put in those cut corners, so that won't be such an issue anymore.
The clip corner.
I know, I'm just looking at it, and it's the same thing. So you get to the Tart Trail, it's not much improved for me. It's pretty much the way I go now. So I may have better facilities. It's not a huge thing. I'm just saying, but like to get, so if you improve that intersection, I'm glad to see the big circle at that intersection of 8th and Munson. So that's a help. I'm love to see it, and that it's along East Bay now and going north. So those are positives. I'm just curious about that stretch along Munson. So I mean, it's the only other thing I would suggest you might do on your maps is in many places where you have existing trails, it's not really clear to me that they're actually connecting. I just assume they're going to connect. There's almost like a little gap there. So.
Thank you. Mr. Treadwell?
Yeah, going off the same area, I see the proposed traffic signal at Davis as a bit of an orphan improvement, as I can say, at least if you coordinate the timing with the two stoplights east and west of that it would be a much more comfortable and friendly for us walk than certainly the current status of Fair or 8th and Munson. But all it would take is a purple line down Davis Street to show, hey, this is actually part of the grid that can serve for the people in the neighborhood to the north of Munson and the people in the neighborhood to the south of Munson, without it making it seem like you need to go to Fair Street on one side or East Bay Boulevard on the other. And sure, you're not going to have a lot of traffic going up and down Munson Avenue by foot or bike, even though there's a lot of commercial activity there. But if you show a connection to bike paths and the mobility network in the middle, right where Davis is, then it would allow for better access to many of those commercial businesses.
Thank you. What do the
And-
rest of you think? What do the rest of you think? Do you have anything to add or ask?
Jackie, you live near here.
No, you can go first, Jackie.
Well, I would appreciate spending some time talking about some of the aspects of the implementation section, Chapter 7. I was especially curious. It appeared that there was, when we're talking about small-scale, tactical sorts of projects, it seemed as though there was a recommendation that those might be exempt from review by our commission, exempt from community engagement, community notification. So I was hoping for some clarification there.
I can speak on that
And-
real quick as far as like the tactical stuff,
Could,
the quick implementations that we're talking about, like the tactical urbanism
Sure, go
or
right
demonstration.
ahead.
So we're currently working on one. We'll be on your study session on Monday, and we don't work outside of public input. We've had multiple meetings on site with property owners and stuff. So I don't think that the plan is saying to forego that.
well, maybe you could take a quick look at pages 71 through 75 and just be sure that there isn't any implication remaining in there. And then on page 70, there was a process chart, and I wondered about if that's a complete and full representation of your vision of the decision-making process, or whether there should be some accommodation of feedback loops from commission to staff, iterative rounds of decision-making. I think, in my observation, we have a tendency to take more than one crack at things, and I wondered if our flow chart should try to be a little more realistic about that.
So in this section of the document, we talk about some of the suggested roles and responsibilities
Right.
to some of the decision-making. And it identifies city staff or other licensed professionals as the key inputs to design decisions, and that the policy boards are generally used to support a project financially, and that it's consistent with the policy documents, of the city. So, working through design level detail at the city commission level or at the planning commission level often does create cycles of iteration. And I would encourage that we help guide staff to bring as complete, well thought through projects to the policy boards for policy decisions, more so than spending the time to dive into design details for a given.
I would suggest that it might be appropriate to show at least some, right now you have the city staff developing preliminary designs and handing off to the planning commission for review. Maybe that needs to be a two-way communication. It could be something as simple as that to indicate more dialogue, a more rigorous decision-making process and more involvement.
So
That would be my suggestion.
that we're making sure that early on in the process, staff are following the policies, that are using the guiding documents.
I think that it is always going to be to staff's advantage to seek input from their governing boards sooner rather than later, and to be prepared for reaction to that.
I have a comment on this because I had a note here too, but it's a different take than yours, which is, I thought it sounds good. It seemed to make sense, the process being proposed, but it's never worked that way in the city, and I don't see it working this way. The city commission has always pretty much looked at the planning commission as a recommending body and taken final action and re-reviewed everything we do. And I know that, nationally, it's not the recommended model that people follow, but in Traverse City, I don't see that changing. So, but anyways, it sounds good to me. I like it, but gives us a little bit more ability to do things and not feel frustrated. So, but you're right, because we spend a lot of time looking at the details, and the city commission will, pretty much makes a decision, but it's the way it is. And that's not going to change. We can't change it. So, and if the city commission doesn't like it, I think they can require an amendment to this. Because that's the process. We will recommend it, and then the city commission will have their say. So,
Maybe that has to change. Planning commission reviews and recommends. Or are you suggesting a whole brand-new process that doesn't exist currently?
No, this was largely our process for like new infrastructure and streets and stuff. So the last one that we had before the planning commission would be Madison and Jefferson.
Yeah.
And that's because it's called out in the Planning Enabling Act that the planning commission will review all new streets, reconstructed streets, plazas, parks, things like that, to make sure that they're consistent with the master plan. And that's specifically what it says. It doesn't say that they will design that, because, the planning commission does not know the spacing requirements that the 10 state standards requires for sanitary, sewer, and water, but the staff does. And so that's why they're designing it, and then the planning commission is providing that overview, making sure it's consistent
But
with.
then sends it back up, right? We
To-
review it, send it back up to city commission, correct?
yeah, but the
Well, city
difference is-
commission essentially approves the contract.
Yes, but they also
Ideally.
approve the design.
Yeah.
They
In,
also
in
debate
approving the contract,
design.
yeah.
So that's why it's a little
We-
off on this.
Yes. I mean, this is the way it should work.
Correct.
But, in practicality, I mean, I've sat through these projects and the city, where you sit here in the planning commission, engineering brings us a project. We ask them questions, they can't answer it, they come back to us, they make some tweaks. We may go through that, it may take them a month to get through the planning commission.
Yeah.
Okay, so we approve everything looks good. And then it, and it comes back, we give it an approval, it goes up to the city commission for their contract, and the city commission usually wants to review it first.
Yeah.
And then they ask questions, and sometimes the answer is, because the planning commission wanted this. And then it's up to the city commissioners who sit on the planning commission to explain it for Sean. But kind of what the thought process is going through that. But they review it, and sometimes they don't like it
Right.
and, make changes. It's just I see from staff's perspective, it can be frustrating.
Moving goalpost sometimes.
Frustrating, yes, and just essentially a more complex process than we're representing here.
I have experience with communities that use this model effectively. But a part of that process includes a significant and meaningful amount of trust and expectation of city staff that they are utilizing the policy document, they are putting forth best practices, that they are doing the due diligence, and are bringing forward a design that's consistent, compliant with policy for the city. But in other communities, I have been a part of this. It does work. There are times where comments were received and plans were adjusted, but largely due to the size of their capital program, frankly, there wasn't the resources to debate every project at that level. So maybe this model doesn't represent the intent in Traverse City or the interest in Traverse City, but I have used this.
One thing that might help that we might want to, if you guys are supportive of this, to add in here as like a policy recommendation. You know, these projects come to the Planning Commission, as I mentioned, for review. Maybe it's a recommendation that the Planning Commission adopts a policy where they will hold a public hearing on them. Because, you know, if we look at this flow chart, we have one time where it comes to the Planning Commission for input. City staff works on doing the design based on that input. So therefore, when we know it's coming back to get their approval, we can notice a public hearing and dedicate that time to get it out there. Might be worth doing.
Yeah.
Another key component of the recommendation includes the public engagement, level of engagement, depending on the type of street project, light, medium, or heavy. There are different recommendations for the type of engagement. Those are opportunities for the entire community to engage in the design process. And so if a board member is so inclined, you know, that would be an opportunity to provide some of that feedback earlier on in the process of the available.
And would it be the city that's doing that community engagement or the planning commission that's doing that community engagement? I'm trying to follow this flow chart.
We would do it on commission's behalf.
Because it says city staff develops preliminary designs, and underneath that, it says community engagement as needed. I'm reading that's coming from the city. Am I wrong in reading it that way?
I mean, that's how we do it now. Yeah.
Oh, it is. So
Yeah, we organize the community engagement efforts.
we meaning planning?
Staff.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it. Okay, got it.
Yeah, and we work a lot with our communications
Okay,
manager
so it's staff, it's not city commission. Got it.
for like the logistics of setting up the events and stuff.
Yeah, okay.
I have a couple comments on the policy recommendations.
So just a minute. Have you finished your questions? Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
Since we're on those pages, just one, I mean, I like the traffic codes. Some of them I have no opinion on one or the other. Some I think just makes perfect sense. I do have an issue with snow clearing enforcement policies. Man, talking about touching a sore spot politically, and the state, you're gonna start enforcing to ensure compliance and enforcement is also a way to generate revenue. That's just like political suicide. I mean, I just, if I was a city commissioner, I'd tell you to strike that right now. As a planning commissioner, it's not a recommendation I would make. One, I don't know if it's accurate. I mean, the amount of money it's going to cost you to try and generate fines, and the amount of people up here will be stubborn about it and take it to the magistrate to fight it, and the amount of time you spend with your attorney, next thing you know, we'll be contracting an attorney on the side just to do snow enforcement, snow clearing ordinances. And I know from a fact that the people who would be responsible for enforcing it don't like doing it. And there's all sorts of situations where it just becomes, you know, you're going to go up to somebody who's elderly and say, well, I don't have money, or how am I going to do this, and is it fair? City's enforcement policy has always been pretty much try to ask and be nice and slowly escalate. Whether you agree with it or not, that's a policy for the city commission to address overall. I mean, sometimes a lot of people will think the enforcement's very lax here, but I don't know if it actually generates revenue or would for the city. I just think to say that we're going to enforce these to generate revenue is
It does
just,
for the city of East Lansing.
I'm just saying it's going to, yeah, we're not in a college town. And you start adding up those for, snow removal, I don't know what to tell you. I'm just saying that's something I'm not comfortable putting in there. Lots of reasons. If the city commission wants to put it in, I would just highlight that,
So similar to the implementation strategy that we've been talking about, as our mobility culture continues to evolve, now might not be the correct time to adopt all of the policy changes that are recommended. We may not be ready to accept this type of change, or this level of accountability at this time. And that's okay, but I think it's important to recognize that in the future state that we are striving towards, that we're looking to achieve, clearing of snow and leaves from cycling facilities is a desirable outcome that we would like to achieve. So I appreciate the realistic approach to how that might apply now, but I think we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge it as maybe something that we would like to achieve from a policy standpoint when appropriate.
I don't disagree with that. I'm just saying, I don't know about the wording you're using here.
Maybe strike the revenue generation
Yes.
part,
Yeah,
yeah,
maybe.
because that might seem a little punitive for financial reasons.
I agree.
The only other thing I had was zoning ordinance. Do we even still have any minimum parking requirements? What zones?
We've only eliminated them for residential uses and the downtown zone. Everything else does have a minimum. In some cases, we have a maximum for some uses. They're pretty lax, but
I thought we had more maximums than minimums, but. yeah,
I would
they're pretty
love to
lax.
have that conversation sometime soon about those minimums.
Put it on the list.
Yeah,
Well, I know we reduced I thought we reduced some of the maximums. Maybe not dramatically, but we may have reduced some of
reduce some of the minimums.
and maximums.
Yeah, I'll have to talk with Dave. Not since I've been here, but I think there's been some work in the
I think it was
past.
just because.
I think
they
it
were
was just before.
Yeah, I think because they were so large. Some of them, like the maximums were just huge. And we looked at it, and I think it came into play like at CVS. We had all that extra parking, and it was allowed because it fit into our maximum.
Yeah.
So I think we might have trimmed that stuff down a little bit. Okay, that was it. I just wasn't sure if we still had any minimum parking requirements in any of our zones.
Yeah, we do.
And the question is, do we even want those? Or need them anymore? Look, everyone's going to build them. We're not going to stop people from building parking.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen that with residential projects where we don't require it, but their lender does. So
Oh, yeah.
they're going to put a, one spot per dwelling unit in for that.
Good.
Can you pull up the network map again? I have a question for everyone's feedback on that, because Brian got me thinking, in addition to maybe scaling this to better fit the periphery, do you think there's value in, as I'm looking at this screen, splitting it into 4 quads and blowing up each
Yes.
quad individually?
Yes.
I
So
think
you have the total and then
Yeah.
the 4?
Yeah.
Okay. The other thing I want to bring up, and this is geared more towards Mitch and Jackie on the city commission, because you guys are going to be starting your strategic planning. So when it comes to implementation, our limiting agent is funding. So I would just ask that maybe you consider bringing that up as a part of the conversation, because if we knew there was some amount of dedicated funding, because a lot of these projects take a year or so to work on, and we don't know if the budget's going to be there, but if we know there's some money to play with, then we know what to work with. or we know what we can leverage as a match for grants. And it just makes it more predictable of what, we can be more nimble knowing what's available for implementation.
I am very interested to see how some of our current planning processes align with the layering on of a strategic planning process.
Yeah.
You know, in a perfect world, the strategic plan is going to be the primary document to help to set spending priorities
Yeah.
to accomplish major goals and objectives. And, you know, we don't have that currently, and what happens when we do, I think, is a legitimate question.
And I know from a staff perspective, that would help us a lot with the CIP, with the, project development and stuff, just to have more direction on what is desired. Because obviously there's probably 10 years worth of work in here. So where do we start first, according to the city commission, is what we would like to get out of that. And there's different approaches, right? I mean, we have all our sidewalks right now because there was a decision made to bond it and do it at once, to get that bang at one time. And there was an argument made at that time that, and I'm not saying that bonding's the answer, but this is just an example, that it's only going to cost more in the future than it is right now, which is generally true. So any direction through that process that you can provide us for prioritization will be greatly appreciated.
It would be helpful for, I think, Mitch and I to know what stage your budget requests are at, and to have visibility so that we know what it is that you're proposing.
Good question. Page 78 of the plan, draft plan, 78, yeah. Under zoning ordinance, there's amend zoning ordinance, and I might be missing the forest through the trees here, but it says amend the zoning ordinance to include a bonus provision or parking reduction where showers are provided.
I asked that question too.
And I don't know what the reference is there.
It is showers, right? Or is that, yeah.
So maybe we need to work on language there. One thing that came out of the leadership team is, if we want to help support people in a desire or encourage them to say commute by bike, that's a barrier to some people. Is like, okay, when I get to work and I'm all sweaty and I work in a very professional
I get that.
setting.
I just huh?
Yeah.
I was the same. I wrote today.
All right, I understand that. That makes
Well, I
sense
liked
now.
your response in the text. She was like, so showers on the side of the street?
Yeah, like,
Not
where are they
quite.
going to do these showers?
Yeah.
I mean, the best thing is to have showers at the workplace, where you're going. That's the best thing. So
Yeah.
what I was envisioning is, especially in like big cities like London, you'll just be walking along and there will be this big stainless steel pod thing that you put some money in. It just opens up.
Put a buck in and you get 5 minutes of hot water.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't think-
those are toilets, but
I don't think we're there yet, but there may be opportunities there to call that out. So like in our zoning ordinance, as planning director, I can decrease the minimum parking requirement. So a good example would be Local Boys on West Front Street. So that was going on when I first started here. Based on their seating, they needed X number of parking, according to the equation in our zoning ordinance. But we were able to work with them on reducing that parking, looking at other elements. They're in a walkable community. They were on the Bay Line. There's bike lanes. Maybe that could be another criteria. Do you have amenities to support non-motorized transportation to your place as a way to justify a reduction in the parking minimum?
Might be like mobility respite services or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
who else has anything to add or?
I actually have a question on that note. Are there incentives for bike parking right now in any ordinances?
I don't think it's incentivized. We do have a bike parking requirement, though.
Okay.
So I believe it's, and I'm off my memory here, one bike parking per 10.
Yeah, there's a formula.
There's
Okay.
a formula in zoning.
Yeah, because I was
ordinance
just
for 10
curious if we
vehicle.
could change the word from showers to bike racks.
Yeah. And
If
so
it's that
these
simple,
are,
but-
I think, great conversations that we'll be able to have as
Yeah.
you all as a planning commission, as us as staff, to figure out how to best maybe check that box in the plan.
I have a question. identify implementation timeline. Who does that?
Well, staff works on that to some extent through the CIP, but that's also based on the criteria of our infrastructure that we evaluate in that decision, and honestly, the funding that we have available. So that's
Let me
why,
rephrase that.
okay.
Do we have a role in that?
I think there is definitely a role for the planning commission to talk about prioritization. When you look at this map, where does it make most sense to start? There's going to be other inputs, as we've discussed so far, to inform that. But another thing that we talked about at the leadership team is maybe there is like a committee form that works on implementation prioritization, if you will, to come with that. Maybe it's the planning commission as a whole. Maybe it's a subcommittee with other partners at the table. But that's a conversation I'd love to have with you guys to think about that, because we've got a lot of good ideas around this table right now.
And a lot of the inputs that I would expect that you would receive from staff are going to be asset management operations focused, where we discussed it earlier, providing that comment around education, might not come from staff. It would be an opportunity for you to say, yep, we want to fund some capital improvement, but we also want to encourage an education. Dollars.
Yeah. I absolutely agree with that. And going back to that strategic planning process that you all be working on, oftentimes we focus on the capital costs, but then we have legacy costs too that have to be incorporated. If we build all of these non-motorized, or even take our sidewalks, for example, you add 20 more miles of sidewalk, that's more staff to plow that and to maintain it. And so we want to make sure that that's getting budgeted, because people get really disappointed when they get something new, but it's not maintained so that they can use it. And oftentimes maintenance is the last thing that gets considered, if considered in the process, because it might mean getting a different piece of equipment, right? If we're going to move towards a certain separated bike lane design, we need to think about how we keep it clear of snow, and how we prioritize that. But that needs to be thought of in the capital expenses and all of those things. And we're lucky to have our new city engineer here. I kind of grabbed her one day and said, "Need to pick your brain about snow clearing and bike lanes." And she's like, "Oh, I got a lot of experience in that." So as a former DPS director in some very progressive winter climates, I think she's going to be a real asset in helping us solve some of these problems effectively.
Great. Anybody else?
Well, I guess I would like to know this piece of the master plan, but also the larger context. At what point does this body get to see the version that incorporates the feedback that's been given so far?
So that would be by the time we have the public hearing, which is at the end of the 63-day public review period.
So approximate date?
I want to say August, sometime in August. I don't have the timeline in front of me.
Yeah, that's fine.
But I know like the very final approval would be city commission, which I think is the beginning of September, and you all would be before that.
Okay.
So, and then again, there may be iterations from that public hearing that you want to see incorporated. So again, the timeline was more of a best case scenario. It's a line, but we might go like this,
Okay.
That's how it happens. So.
But it doesn't come back to this body specifically for kind of confirmation that we were heard accurately or anything?
Oh, yeah, you'll have that chance.
Does it?
Yeah, so what we'll be doing is working with the consultants of both plans to take this feedback and begin incorporating it over the next couple of weeks and stuff. And we can spend as much time as you want doing that verification during that 63-day period, because we're just in a holding pattern. We're going to be collecting comments, but we can't act on anything until that clock expires.
Okay, thank you.
And sorry about my voice. I know it's...
That's okay. Get it.
Yeah.
Going once. Are we? Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. That was a great discussion. Looking forward to all the public discussion. I think it's going to be exciting. So the next thing on our agenda is public comment. Would anyone like to make a public comment? Yes, 5 minutes.
Tim, I think you know the rules
You
for
know the
public
rules.
comment, don't you?
Name and address, 5 minutes.
I'll be brief. Tried to make notes, so I would stay brief. Excellent conversation. I think last time I was in front of you, I was inviting you to be advocates for pedestrians and cyclists. And really, this is just a follow-up to that, given the topic of this evening. And being that yesterday, I think, was Earth Day, and having that in mind, the city, as the city commission, approved 2016 resolution, carbon neutral as a city by mid-century. I'm hoping that you'll consider a timeline in this, maybe not an actual timeline, but at least a goal, a stated goal. Because if we are to be carbon neutral by mid-century, things, home projects, whatever it might be, they always take longer than you think. So I would propose 2040 be the goal, to have this plan, and not just what's on the map, but also what Mr. McGillivray is referring to, what's not on the map, because we will have a complete streets policy. Have a recent complete streets resolution, which calls out drafting a policy, speaks to all streets and all users. So it will get to his neighborhood. Anyhow, so if 2040 is a goal, and yes, we don't have a dollar amount yet. We talk about, dollars, and that's not really our purview and city commission, how much money, et cetera. But somebody's got to start that conversation, and you folks are as good as us to start that conversation. Is it 10 million, 20 million? What is this? And if our goal is 2040, like, let's have that honest conversation as a community, not just you folks, but the whole community. So, like, our eyes go wide open, like, holy cow, by 2040, we're going to spend that much money. But if that's what we intend to do, let's have that conversation and intend to do it. Or we say, nope, that's too much. Let's scale this back. We can't do all that. But let's have that honest conversation, because I would hate to see it become just a study on the shelf, and we do some incremental every year a little bit, and that's great, but we're not actually getting there. And I would compare it to the sidewalks that were referenced that we bonded for, and there were safe routes to school. But prior to that effort, which took several years to get to, the city, all of us, our plan was a 100-year plan. We were spending money on sidewalks, and we had this goal, but the rate of spending was going to take us 100 years to get there. So let's not have a 100-year plan. Let's have a real plan, if we can scrape the money together. But if we make it a priority as a city and as a community, we can do it. So thank you, and keep going.
Mr. Warner. Anyone else have a public comment back there? Okay. Announcements, do we have any?
Well, the first one is unfortunate. Next week will be Chief Tuller's last meeting with us, as he has tendered his resignation. I think just over 8 years you've been on the Planning Commission now, and
Yeah, my hair was brown when I started.
I saw some of those pictures. Yeah,
I'd
Are
like-
you retiring?
I'd like his notes too.
no,
This is official. No, I'm not retiring.
everyone thinks that that's what.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, I think he'll be here for a while. But we really appreciate your service, and we'll acknowledge more at next week's meeting as well. The other is just, as you know, I had the chance to attend the National Planning Conference last weekend and beginning of the week in Minneapolis, which was exhausting but great. It was 4 straight days of sessions. To be honest, a little overwhelming because there's typically about 10 sessions going on every hour, so you have to pick and choose. Some weren't all that applicable, so that made it easy. But as a registrant, myself, and then Leslie will be doing the same, we get to participate in the mobile option at the beginning of, or the online option that we'll be doing at the beginning of May. So look forward to grabbing a few more sessions there. Couple key bits of data just to share that I thought was very interesting. It's kind of across the spectrum from what I saw, but they're predicting by 2040, across the nation, 81% of our households in the nation will be occupied by one person or a couple, as kids are going down less and less. Downtowns, post-COVID, are struggling across the nation. Most downtowns were not very resilient, the way that a monocrop is not resilient, and that they hedge too much on office use and not enough mix of other uses. And so therefore, we're seeing commercial vacancy rates the highest they've been in almost 25 years. I thought this was interesting. across the nation, 90% of downtown non-office commercial sells alcohol, caffeine, or food in some form. 90%, that's a pretty high number there. So, and then just two quick little stories on that. I was attending one session on public discontent that we see across the country right now is very interesting. But two outrageous examples. In one council meeting, residents came and they glued their hands to the walls around the window to protest their local government's inaction on stopping global conflict. And another one, a gentleman was very frustrated that the city was replacing its streetlights with LEDs and that it would have a negative impact on the wildlife. So he caught a bunch of live squirrels and released them in the council chamber during the meeting. So we haven't gotten that at the city yet, but
Careful.
Yeah, why are you suggesting that?
probably shouldn't put those ideas out there, but
Was it a planning commission dog that interrupted a county commission meeting last year?
no, that was my dog. He figured out how to open the door. But yeah, I have plenty more to share. I haven't had a chance to really unpack all my notes and everything from it since I've gotten back. But after the next round of sessions that we'll be able to attend, we can probably have some more takeaways from you. One thing I will take away, or one takeaway that I'll share with you, is when you listen to what these communities are struggling with and the approaches that they've taken or are working on, Traverse City is really ahead of the curve on a lot of this stuff. And that's not to say that there's not much work there. And I don't say that because it's work that I've done or my staff. We haven't been here long. It's been decades of work. But the concept of downtown, no parking requirements is not very common everywhere. It's surprising how many downtowns across the nation don't allow residential in their commercial core. So things that we just become commonplace in our community aren't that way across the nation. So with that, I just, keep up the good work. There's a lot of good things happening here. But again, a lot more work to do. So that's it.
Thank you. Anyone else have any announcements? Well, thank you for being here. Don't forget, we have a meeting next Tuesday, same time, and we're adjourned. Students,
Oh, yes, we will sign.
you will sign. Come forward, bring pens.
You're probably going to want Tullers. That's going to be worth something one day.
He's pretty famous. You want me to sign, Sean, or you going to sign?